Okay, I'm starting out with another blank scene, and just going to File and New, and setting up a new sky, and it's still pretty much the default sky. But we're going to start out, and we're going to add a terrain. And position the camera, and actually we want to use a procedural terrain. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. We're going to right mouse click and select the procedural terrain. And this will just give us a lot more detail with the object we're working with. I'm going to double click on this terrain so we can bring up our editor. And I don't specifically want a mountain on this one, so I'm going to turn off zero edges. And now we're going to get a nice even flow of the terrain throughout. I'm going to click OK. And now, as you can see, we have a nice terrain in here. And what we can do is go in and move the camera down inside of this area. And because it is a procedural, we can go in as close as we want, and we won't lose any detail. And go ahead and kind of... Actually, I'm going to undo that. And we're going to deselect the terrain so that we can rotate our camera by itself and not have it rotating around the terrain. As you can see, we also have this part of the terrain clipped out, and if you notice in the preview window that it's still there and it's not missing, basically it just means that the camera is a little bit too close to that part of the terrain. Now, because we're working with a terrain, we have our scale set to 1. Or that's actually for the material. But if we go to our position, and this second thing right here, which will give us all of our coordinates in different sizes, we see our size is only 128 by 128. And that's not very large, especially for a terrain. So I want to actually go ahead and increase this, because this will give us much better options when it comes to using our fog and different sky effects like that. Because if it's too small, little bits in the slider, if we slide it even a 1%, it's going to make too much of a change within these small objects. So I'm going to increase this to 2000 and 2000, both on the X and the Y. And the Z, we can actually up that to probably 500, and hit enter. And now we're going to move our camera back up. And as you can see, we have a much larger terrain now. And it takes a little longer to navigate through it, but you'll see that we won't have this clipping effect that we had before, because the scene is much larger and it's a lot more realistic in this aspect. So you want to increase the size of your terrains just so that it's more realistic, because with the atmosphere effects, you really want to make sure that we're working with kind of a scene that's relatively the size that it would be. And deselect that and go ahead and move our camera up, and we're going to move or rotate it up and then move it down. And we're going to get in here and take a look. And you can see there's a little bit of distortion in the view that will show up every once in a while, but that'll go away, and we have a nice terrain here. Now we want to apply our texture to this terrain, so I'm going to select the terrain in our layer view down here. We're going to go to this first tab, which is our material, and double click to pull up our material editor. And we want to set our simple material. And in this case, what we're going to be doing is actually using a color map, a mapped picture, for our color map. So we're going to select map picture, and we're going to go down here to this little arrow and click load. And this is going to bring up all of our preset sort of textures that are already loaded into Vue. But what you can also do is, if you have JPEG images or bitmaps or TIFFs or anything like that, even HDRIs, you can go ahead and load these in as a new collection. And what I've actually done is loaded in our Seamless Rock collection, which is great for making terrains. And I'm going to go ahead and grab one of these. And as you notice, there's black bars over the tops of most of these, and those won't show up in the scene. That's just pretty much stating that it's not perfectly square. And if you look at the pixel ratio, it is 8 megapixel, and it's standard 4:3, so it's not square. We're going to click OK with Rock 59, and now it's going to ask this if we want to use this as an image sequence, and we're going to say no. And if we ask it to do an image sequence, what it's doing is, because the rock textures are named 0001, 0002 for each one, all the way up to I think around 80 or so, it'll detect that as a sequence, and you can load that in as an animation to play over time throughout the scene. But we don't want to do that, so we just want to make sure we don't load it in as an image sequence. And now we have that texture applied to this surface, and we're going to take a look at how it affects our terrain. And as you can see, mapped onto our terrain right now, it's quite large. So we could go into the actual surface right here, and we could change the image scale. But since we're going to be working with a mixed material, it's going to be easier to size the overall scale underneath here, underneath our preview, and this is going to size down everything in the material. And this way we don't have to go specifically into the color map and change it, and then go into our mixed material and change that one, and then if we have any other materials, change that. This will just do it overall, and we can keep everything in relation. And because this is too large, we're going to type in 0.1 and hit enter and just see what effect that takes on our terrain. And as you can see, we have a lot more detail in here, but that's still fairly large, especially for the type of image that it is. There's a lot going on in it, and it's very high resolution. So I'm going to type in 0.05 and take a look and see what that does. And you just got to play around with it until you get the right amount. And as you can see, maybe that's a little too big this time. We have some nice variations in there, but with this type of surface, that might be a bit much. So we can go to 0.08, and now we have a nice variation on here. We're going to go ahead and do a preview render. But first we're going to take a look at our render options, or I'll do a preview render first. If we go up to this first option up here, you can also hit F9 to render. But if I left mouse click on this, you'll see this main view is going to create a preview render. And depending on the size of this view, depends on how large this preview render is going to be. If, of course, we double click on this and we have our 4 views, it will create your preview render in that small view. But we can change that so we can just actually set the resolution to whatever it is we want and have it come up in a separate window. And that can sometimes look a lot better, or depending on the size you want to, that's definitely the best way to go. And you can also change a lot of the other aspects in our render options. But as you can see, we have our preview rendering right now, and you can see this is a real nice looking rock texture. We get a lot of variation in here. You can see the detail is just fantastic, because these are very high resolution textures in the rock collection. So now we got that beep. That means that it's done with our preview render, and we're going to go ahead and we can see that everything looks really good. So we're just kind of taking a look at the scale of the image right now over the whole terrain, and I think that's good enough. So we're going to go ahead and right mouse click on what we just clicked to render, and now we have all of our render settings. If we change render to screen, what this will do is cause a pop-up window to come up, and now that pop-up window is based on our screen resolution. Because we're in main view right now, you can see that we have absolutely no control over our resolution, just our aspect ratio. So we're going to go to render to screen, and we can set this to 640 by 480, which is approximately standard TV resolution. It's actually 720 by 480 with the pixel aspect ratio of 0.9. But we're going to stick with 640 by 480 right now. And you can also type in, if you go to other, you can type in a specific pixel amount. You can also go all the way up to 1600 by 1200 or wherever you want. And then if you take a look under aspect ratio, we also have different settings for whether or not you're doing film or IMAX, and this will set your aspect ratio. If we go to Panavision, this is going to give us like a sort of a widescreen. And as you can see, it's 640 by 272, so that's going to be very widescreen. We can also 800 by 340. So if I click OK right now, you can see that that cut down our render area, and that's what these sort of light blue areas over the scene are, and everything inside here is what's going to be rendered. And you can also see that showing up in the preview window. I prefer using widescreen. I think it looks a lot better than if we were using full frame. We could also set this to even television 16 by 9. You just go through here and look for 16 by 9, click on that, and we can go to 640 by 360 on that one. And then this will change our resolution to a 640 by, 16 by 9 aspect ratio, which is a little bit bigger than film widescreen. Now if we go ahead and we render this, you'll see that it pops up in a new window. And that's because we set it to render in new window and not on the main view. So this will go ahead and render our preview in this window. And now the reason I say preview right now is because we have it set to preview mode. I'm going to hit escape on the keyboard, and that will stop our render. And I can close that out. Right mouse click on those for the render options again. And as you can see, our render quality is set to preview. We can also set it to final, broadcast, superior, ultra, and then you could do user settings where you can actually go in and select what you want rendered. The effects quality, you could set that higher, lower, whether or not you want anti-aliasing on for objects or textures, and you could also set all of these different options in here. But we're going to use the final render, and this is going to render a lot differently. You can also go ahead and set what you want to render, whether or not you want to render the objects only, only active layers. So you could go ahead and turn layers on and off, visible layers, same thing, or render everything. And then you could set as render all, always render all lights, or always render lights. And there's just lots of different options in here. And you can also set up your multipass options. And what you can also use, if you are hooked up to several different computers, you can use Hyperview. And Hyperview is really cool because it uses render cow, it's called. And if you have several computers hooked up to your computer right now, or computers on a network, you can install render cow on each one of those computers, and then you can use Hyperview, and it'll actually plug into all those other computers and use their processors to render. And it works for individual frames and animations, so that will really speed that up. I can't really show that right now because I'm not really on a network, but I'm just going to show you this final render now. So if we can also click render in this view, and now we're going to see it pops up, and it's going to render from the bottom up now. And before, as we were seeing before, we got a very pixelated look, and then it would go ahead and go down and double the pixels as we go. But with this final render, or any render higher than preview, you're going to get it from the bottom up, and it's going to render the complete pixels at a time. And I'm just going to go ahead and pause it now and wait till it's done. Okay, it's completed rendering now, and as you can see with our final render, it actually looks a lot better. Our texture looks a lot better overall, and our shadows look a lot better and things like that. But this is just with one image map right now. What we can go ahead and do is set it to a mixed material, because let's say we want to have a separate material on these mounds than what we have on the bottom. Now this is a very, I say mixed image map as far as the way it looks. There's a lot of variation to it, and we could leave it the way it is right now with just that image map. But if I click, double click on this preview up here, we're going to set this to a mixed material. And what this is automatically going to do is show us our second material, which is the one it's mixing with. And as you can see, because we don't have influence of environment on where we had the split, it's blending the two together. And so if you don't have distribution of materials depending on local shape, altitude, and orientation on, it will just go ahead and blend those two together. 50% opacity on first one, on each one, and then you could also adjust which material you're leaning towards, whether it's towards one or the second one. We're going to go back to 50% on that, so it's evened out. And we're going to double click on this gray material, which is the new one we just loaded in. And this will also give us our simple material, which is the way we set up our first material right here. And actually, this changed our screen. When we set this to mixed material, once you set it to mix, you don't want to set it back to simple unless you just want to keep this individual texture. If you would like to open this one back up, you can just double click on it, and this is back where we set our first texture. I'm going to click OK. We're going to go to Material 2 now, which is our simple, and we're going to set this to Map Picture, and we're loaded. And now we can load in another one of our images. And I'm going to include some of these rock textures on the DVD, so if you go to the Content folder on the DVD, you'll be able to find some of these rock textures from this collection. And I'm going to grab something that's really going to stand out separately from this other one. So I'm going to grab this kind of red rock in here and click OK. And it's going to ask us if we want to load the image sequence, and I'm going to say no. And that's pretty much all we need to do for that. So I'm going to click OK. And now, as you can see, these two are blending together. And if we take a look and click on our preview window, it will update our OpenGL view first, and then update our preview. And as you can see, it became a lot darker now, and it's just blending the two maps together. So we're getting that reddish color on there, but still with the distinctive highlights and dark areas of the first one. But we want to set this up based on altitude and different bumps and things like that. So I'm going to go to Influence of Environment, check this first box here, and as you can see, this already split it in half. And if we go ahead and render that, we can take a look and see the effect. And mostly what it did was it pretty much cleared out everything because we don't have the right settings just yet. So you just want to kind of play around with it. We can bring up our influence of altitude a little bit higher and see if that has any effect on it. And it doesn't seem to still bring out our new texture. We did have a little bit in there. If I change it down to none in the opposite direction, we might notice a little bit more. Now we can see mainly just this next material 2 on there of the mixed material. So we'll bring it up a little bit higher, and there's really a large amount of difference between 100 and 0. But now that I've set it, you can see that we have our red areas kind of on the tops of the mounds, and our other texture kind of underneath it. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and now we're going to do a render of that. Okay, we have our completed render, and as you can see now, we have all of these red flecks kind of on the tops of lots of the surfaces where we have different changes in altitude and things like that. You can see it down here, and it's showing up mostly on the flat surfaces. And on the angles, we have that other texture. So it's really neat effect you can get on here. You can, of course, increase this, and you could also use like grass and things like that. You could use some of the procedurals and even mix the image maps with the procedurals and load up the grass texture to replace this red one. So you could get grass on the upper ends of the slopes here. And just really neat blending options you have with this. And I would highly suggest using image maps because you will get the best look. It will look more realistic because image maps textures are already real. So you're just kind of mapping the realism to a predefined terrain or a terrain you've modeled yourself. So it's a really neat effect, and as you can see, that's very realistic looking. The sky looks a little fake right now, but we can go ahead and change that in a little bit. But what we're going to do right now is add a little bit of water, and since we have this lower section right here, we can add water and pull it up to around here so we can have water coming around through here. So we'll go up to our Infinite Planes panel and select water. And now what we can actually do is, if we want, we could go ahead and pull it up in this viewport and watch the preview window to see when it kind of raises up to the point where we need it to. And as you can see, now we have that water coming in through here. We'll raise it up maybe a little bit higher. And as you can see, now we have water going all the way around through here. And it just gives us a really kind of neat effect. What we could also do is change the size of our water if we wanted to. And I also want to note too, if we go back to our procedural terrain, as you can see, our scale of the texture is actually up to 1. And before we actually made it smaller. But what we actually made smaller before was our simple material. So now that we've created a mixed material, it's an entirely different material. It still kept the size and the scale of our simple material, which is that rock underneath, but now that we have a full mixed material, it's reset our scale to 1. So you can also change the scale of that as well, and so it's pretty much just reset it back to its normal state, but our simplified material is still set to that lower texture amount. What we could do now is go ahead and load a new atmosphere. Instead of just creating a new one, we're just going to go ahead and load one in, because there are some really neat ones in here. I actually like one of the animated ones. If we can go ahead and select clouding over Montana and click OK. And this will load in our new sky. And it also reset our sun, but as you can see, the effect that we have as far as the coloration on this mountain just looks fantastic. On these hills here. What we could also do is adjust the lighting if we wanted to. And keep in mind, the animated materials, you could still render stills with them. A lot of them are different, and some of them are really neat looking, but there's no still versions of them. So it's not really a big deal if you go ahead and just use these as stills if you want to. You could also do the other way around. You could go ahead and grab some of the non-animated skies and just turn on the animation like we did before in the atmosphere editor. Just increase the velocity and the change over time, and you could just make them animated that way. So the presets are really neat, and you could probably go ahead online and download a lot of different ones or create your own, and you could just get some neat effects. What I also want to show you now is how to save the camera. I like this view we're in right now, but let's say we wanted to try something else. We want to move it around, but we don't want to lose the state we're in, and we don't want to have to go into an animation and kind of create keyframes, because if we are animating, then we'll have to change that back. So if we click this little disk right here, right below the preview window on the left, we can click Store Camera. And if we expand our main camera down here, you'll see we now have camera 1. It's because before we just had main camera and top camera, but now we have camera 1. So what it did was it saved this camera and created a new one. And now we can use these little arrows to cycle through our cameras, and now we're at camera 1. So what we can go ahead and do is change our camera however we want to. Go ahead and maybe we want to come on this side over here and frame that up over here. And we can take a look at the preview and see if we like it or not. And that looks alright. But let's say now we want to go back to exactly where we were before. Well, our main camera is still in the same position because we moved camera 1. So we can click this arrow, and it's going to bring us to our main camera, which is also going to change it in our view. And as you can see, we're in the exact same spot we were before. So you can store as many cameras as you want and keep making new cameras and just switch through them, so you don't have to lose the state you're in if you have found a good framing and you want to keep it that way. There's also other framing options for your camera. If you go up here to on this first button right here, and we can show frame guides, and we're going to display safe frames and grid. And we're also going to show the field grid, and these are all different options that you can use to help frame your scene. And as you can see, that added, these are our safe areas. Everything within these blue boxes is the safe area, and if you're not familiar with working with television or anything like that, pretty much this is what will show up on the TV, guaranteed, because certain televisions are different, and sometimes this stuff, the outer stuff, can get clipped out. So pretty much this main blue line right here, the first one, and the inside is your safe area inside of there. And then everything outside, sometimes you don't know whether or not that's going to show up on the TV, because a lot of times things will not show up. We also added this kind of point system in here, and if you're familiar with photography at all, you'll know that these are our main focus points, these 4 points right here. So a lot of time, depending if you're how you're framing it, your main focus will show up in one of these points. So if you have something in the screen that's definitely stands out more than anything, you could set it so it's in one of these 4 points in the corners, and it'll show up more than anything else. So if you have worked with photography or filming at all, you'll know that that's how that 4-point system works. But we're going to go ahead and turn that off. Just go to our frame guides and turn off safe frames and grid. And then you could also turn off the frame strips, which are these top strips right here, which show us our view. But I'm going to keep those on because we want to see exactly what it is that we're framing. And now we're going to actually go ahead and edit our sun. Okay, so we're going to hit F4 on the keyboard to open up our atmosphere editor. And under sun, we're going to use these sliders to rotate the camera around. And we can take a look at the preview and see an update of what's going on with the light right there. Of course, our light right now is in front of our objects, so we're getting dark shadows on everything. So we can go ahead and move that around so it's kind of behind. And pretty much we're just adjusting the sun so that we get a nice lighting effect on our terrain that we have right here. Just waiting for that to update. We could also adjust our pitch, how high up in the sky it is. And if we want direct lighting, all the way down on it. And as you can see, that really brightened everything up. And we're still getting that nice yellow effect on everything, and that's because the type of sky we have has that yellow gradient on it, and it's affecting all of our objects, so it looks really neat. We also have a little bit of fog in there. I'm going to go ahead and kind of change this just a little bit more. And you just kind of want to frame it or set it to so you're getting the right amount of shadows or where you want it, and you just want to set it up so it looks good. And that's kind of nice right there. We have a nice shaded area over here, but we still have a lot of light in the background. So I'm going to click OK, and we're going to leave our sun right there. The next thing I want to talk about now is ecosystems, which we haven't covered yet. But ecosystems is definitely what puts Vue in the lead as far as objects. And if you can see right now, we already have 167,000 polygons in the scene. But now we're going to create an ecosystem, and that's easily going to jump up into the billions. And actually, Vue is going to be able to handle that perfectly. So we're going to select our procedural terrain, because an ecosystem is based in the material editor. We're going to double click on our material and go ahead and check this ecosystem. And now what this does is this is pretty much a new window. And we have our underlying material. If we double click on that, that's going to bring us back to our mixed material, which we just had before we added the ecosystem. And I'm just going to click OK to close that out. And now we have our ecosystem options. And pretty much what you can do in here is add anything you want to create your ecosystem. If you're not familiar with it, it's a way of adding trees and objects and distributing them over surfaces to create forests and rock fields and just about anything. You can do so much with it. So we're going to make sure we're in the General tab, and we're going to go to Add. And that's going to give us an option whether or not we want to add a rock, a plant, or an object. So you can use any of the objects that come with Vue for this, or you could also model your own in a separate program and use those as your ecosystem. Or you can even use objects you've created in Vue and save those specifically as objects and load those in for your ecosystem. We're going to select plant right now. And what that's going to do is let us choose a plant. So we can choose trees or brush, any of the weeds. There's any of the plants you can choose from, any of the alien plants, edited plants, or any of the ones you've customly created and put into your personal plants collection. Right now, I'm going to select the dry weeds and click OK. And now what we have right here is our scale, so the size of our individual plant, and this is by individual plant, and the presence of our individual plant. So how much it's going to show up. Presence is really based on if you have more than one object. And you can go ahead and just keep adding more plants and add as many as we can, but we're going to add one right now. And because of the size of our terrain, we're going to go ahead and scale this down just a bit to 0.6, and we're going to go to density. I'm going to turn off decay near foreign objects right now so I can show you exactly what that does. But we can adjust the overall density, so how much that surface is being covered by all of these objects. And this is not just for one specific object, this is for everything you have in there, and this is where presence comes in. So if we added another one, we could have our density set up really high, but if we change our presence really low on this one and really high on another one, we'll have more of the other one than we do of this one. So we're going to go to our density, we're going to change it up a little higher. And we're not going to worry about these other settings just yet. But now we're going to hit populate. And as you can see down here, we have our bar moving across the screen, which is populating and adding all of the thousands of little objects that are going to show up all over the material. Okay, it's done loading in or populating our terrain with those objects. And we can take a look at the preview render now. Go ahead and just left mouse click on it to refresh. And we're going to wait for that to refresh. And also in the view, right now we can't really see any of the plants, but as you can see, they are showing up in our preview view. And we're going to go ahead and click on that terrain. And as you can see, we have some of the plants in here showing up, and now they show up in our preview. Just need to refresh. And I'm going to click OK on this right now, just so we can take a look at all of our objects. And go ahead and click on that again to reload it. And maybe we need to just refresh our camera, because sometimes those will disappear depending on how much is showing up in the scene and how long it takes to just calculate that. As you can see now, we have 684 million polygons in the scene, so it went up quite a bit with this. But the beauty of Vue is right now it's showing just two-dimensional images to represent where those objects are. And it's not actually showing the objects, because if it did that, there's no way your computer would be able to process 684 million polygons. So if we take a look right now, we can see all of these plants throughout the object showed as two-dimensional planes. But if we were to render it right now, we would see these objects in their full glory, and I think each one of these dry weeds is probably about 100,000 polygons each. So I'm going to go ahead and render this right now, and we can take a look at it. Okay, it's finished rendering, and you can see we have all these high poly plants in the scene now, and they look really good. But if you also notice, we have plants coming out of the water. And the reason for that is we turned off an option when we were setting up the ecosystem. You can also see in here too, we have plants underneath the water. Now, the way to get rid of that is we're going to go to our surface, and under ecosystem, under density, decay near foreign objects. We're going to turn it on. And I'm going to turn it down to about 2%. And now what this does is it will create all of your objects on the main surface, but once a foreign object comes into view, and that's any object that's not actually what you have the terrain applied to, and you got to make sure you populate too. After every single time you make any changes, you have to repopulate. But what it's going to do is make it so it won't create any of the ecosystem under the water. Or you could also do this if you put a rock or something on top of that terrain, next to the terrain or something like that. It will not create those objects or the ecosystem next to that object, so it's considered a foreign object. You could also adjust the fall off on that. So right now it's set to 0, so what's going to happen is once it reaches that shoreline, it's just going to stop creating it. And 2% the influence by the shoreline, so just a little way away from the shoreline, it's just going to stop creating them altogether. We could set a fall off to that, and what it would do is slowly disperse the amount of coming down. So we could have maybe a row of 10, and then after that it would be like a row of 7, and then it would work its way down, falling off to 0, and there would be no more created. So there's just some really neat things you can do with the ecosystem, and you get a lot of different options. We also have variable density, and right now we're still populating that ecosystem, but we have variable density. So what we can do is right now our density is just creating it all over, and there's nothing patterned about it or anything like that. It's just kind of random. What we could do is we have this graph right here, and we could set it up, our density specifically to populate in certain areas. I'm going to go ahead and click OK right now, so we can take a look at our procedural terrain, and we'll come back to that. But I just want to show you how the objects are no longer created on the shoreline. And you see that we have the shoreline right here, and we have no more plants down here, and they're all kind of up here. And this is that 2% that we have, is the distance between here and here. We could set that to 1%. We could probably get them all the way down up to the shoreline. But we're going to go back and look at density. If we double-click on this, or we'll turn on variable density, we can double-click on this, and we could set up that way. Or we could double-click on the preview, and we could set it up based on procedural. So if you want, you could have it being created. As you can see, the white part is where it'll be created the most, and in the black parts where it'll be created the least. So we could also do it like this, and this would give us our nice rows and things like that. Uh, so there's just a lot you can do with it. There's also avoid overlapping instances, and what that will do is, if we were to set it right now, it would pretty much make all of our plants go in a row. So it's really great if you're making like an orchard or something like that, or certain gardens, and there's really a lot you can do with it, and it'll keep them all from overlapping. And right now they're not really overlapping, but a little bit of space around them might make Vue think that they kind of are overlapping. So it might straighten them out and make them all go in a straight line. So there's really a lot you can do with it. I'm gonna go ahead and click OK. And another thing we could do too is right now we have our rock, that red rock of the surface, kind of showing up in little peaks right here. What we could also do is base it on altitude and make it so that it changes once we reach the shoreline. So we could set all this to a rock texture and then create a sand texture to start right at the shoreline and work its way under the water, because the water is transparent, and right now we're going to see that rock underneath it. But there's a lot of, we're not going to do that, but if you take a look at some of the object files, if we go to File Open, or some of the scene files that have already been saved, and we go to Procedural Terrains, and you take a look at any of these all have that set up. As you can see right here, and even in the preview of this one, we have that nice rock, and then it gets green and then sandy underneath the water. So there's just different things you can do with it. Same thing with this one, and that's based on altitude. So if you want, go ahead, take a look at one of these surfaces, these procedural terrain scenes, and just look at it and look at the textures and in relation to the size of the terrain, and you can really get a feel for what's going on. We're going to go back to our material now. I'm going to show you how to create another plant in there. Let's say we want to add some trees. Well, we can go Add Plant, and we're going to select the plum tree and click OK. And now you can't edit these specific trees or anything like that. What you'll have to do is, if you want a specific editing on each one of the trees, you'll have to go ahead and create a custom plant and then save it, and then you can load that plant in. Otherwise, it's going to create the default surface for the plum tree. And keep in mind too, as far as wind goes, right now in our atmosphere, if we go to our atmosphere editor and we go to wind, we can see that wind is on. I'm going to click OK, and wind is automatically defaulted on for most plants. So what we can do is, if we animate this, we'll actually see the leaves and stuff moving for each one of the plants. So it's really neat. But now we have our plum tree in here, and we want to have less plum trees than we have the dry weed. So we're going to turn our presence down to 0.5, and we're going to up our density just a little, and turn off variable density because we don't need that on. And I'm going to hit populate. And now it's actually populating a lot quicker because we have bigger things in the scene, bigger plants, and that's because our size of these trees are going to be quite large. So it won't have to create as many of them. I'm going to go ahead and click OK and just show you what that did. And as you can see in the preview already, we can see some very large trees are going to be in here. But what we have is our large trees, and then we only have a few plants in here, and that's just because our trees are so large comparatively to the size of our plants. But all we got to do is go ahead and scale down those trees. If we go to General, go to the plum tree, and we want to scale those down to 0.5. And the presence will make a little bit lower, and we're going to up our presence on our dry weeds up to 2. And then we're going to populate it. Okay, we're done populating. I'm going to hit OK, and we can take a look at what happened. As you can see, not everything's loaded in yet, but we can see these small trees. There we go. Now it's all loaded in. The trees are a lot smaller now, which means there's a lot more. And we have more of this brush in here, those weeds that we have added. And this is a little more relation to the size of the terrain. We could also make those smaller and make even more of them just by upping the density. And even with the variable density, we could create just tons of different options for it. There's also ecosystems preloaded. If we go ahead, and I'm not going to clear this out, but I just want to show you, if we go to the load material arrow for our procedural terrain, If we scroll all the way down, there's ecosystems. And we can select that. And these are preset ecosystems. And there's lots of neat stuff in here. There's marine, which will have just tons of different anemones and stuff growing on coral in a really neat look. And there's just tons of different things you can have on here. Pastures, and there's just, like, so you can add any of one of these ecosystems to your terrain, and then that way you don't have to create it. Garden is really neat, and I'm going to show you that one. So I'm going to close this out, and we're going to create a new scene. So we're just going to go File, New, and we'll leave our sky actually with this clouding over Montana, the animated one, because I really like that one. It gives a nice coloration, and I'm not going to save it because I'm not going to need it. And we're going to go ahead and create a regular terrain this time. And I'm going to go ahead and move our camera around, zoom out, kind of bring it towards where the light is. Double click on it. I'm going to turn off zero edges. And actually, zero edges with a standard terrain, as you can see, that's actually clipping the edges around it. So I click mountain again. And as you can see, zero edges on a standard terrain will take it away. So actually, I will change this to a procedural terrain so we can get that effect in there. Double click on it, turn off zero edges, and now we get an entirely different type of terrain. There's one other thing we can do in here too, and that is, let's say we wanted this part to be higher, or as you can see in the bottom part, we had this rift kind of where we could add a river. Well, let's say we wanted to invert that. So there's an invert button right here, and that will invert our terrain entirely. And actually, there's some really neat stuff you can do with this. If you want to save specific terrains as object files and load them in, you can invert them and get some variations in there. And actually, our box cover, that's what we did for it, was we went ahead and took one of our preset terrains and just inverted it to make it a little different, added a different texture to it, and it created an entirely different terrain. So there's just lots of neat stuff you can do with it. Because we're going to be loading in that garden texture, I want to flatten this out. So I'm going to constrain on the Z, go up to our slider here, and I'm going to pull this down. And instead of editing it in the texture editor, which could take a little while, I'm just going to flatten it in here, and now we have a flatter terrain. And now we're going to go up and add that ecosystem. So we click this button right here. We have garden selected already, so I'm going to click OK. And now it's going to ask if we want to automatically populate it. And we're just going to say yes, because we do want this to be populated. And actually, that other thing that came up was based on the procedural terrain. And I'll go back to that. But I'm going to show you this garden first. And this garden's really neat because it has all different types of plant species in here, and they're spaced out, and it really looks like a garden. So it's kind of neat. We could change the atmosphere to something a little bit brighter, so maybe you could see that a little bit better. And you can see our preview in here now, and we have really neat looking stuff going on. But I'm going to go back to before we loaded that in that terrain. Actually, I'll just create a new one. Create a new procedural. We're going to go in and select that garden texture again, because I kind of skipped over that first window, and I want to describe exactly what that says. This operation will modify the mapping of mode of procedural terrain. Pretty much what it's going to do is, because of the type of mapping on here, it will change our shape of our terrain. And it's asking if we want to add nodes to preserve our altitude function of our terrain. So we're going to click yes on that. And always click yes if you've already created your terrain first. And that way what it'll do is make sure that your terrain shape doesn't get altered by adding in a preset. And then once again, you get the ecosystem automatically populated. I'm going to click no because we're not going to be working with this one anymore. But that's just kind of a neat thing you can do. Another thing I want to show you is kind of a randomization, and also the drop objects. I'm going to create a standard terrain now, and go ahead and make a plant. First I'll make this just a little bit bigger. Still constraining on the Z because we had it like that before. So actually I'll go back and make it a little smaller. Turn off the constraint, make it a little tiny bit bigger, and zoom out. And now we're going to add a plant. So we're going to right mouse click on this plant. We're going to select the plum tree. And now we can double click on that plum tree and bring up our editor. And there's one other thing I wanted to show you with this plant editing, and that is the wind. If we go up here to this button right here, we can click on that, and it will give us our overall sensitivity of trunk and branches with our wind, and the sensitivity of leaves to the breeze. So wind affects the trunk and branches, and the breeze affects the leaves. So we can adjust our intensity, and if we have our atmosphere with wind on, it will affect our tree throughout the animation. So I'm just going to click OK. And we're going to leave that the way it is. And also what you can do is also create a new plant or save this plant if we make any changes to it. And I'm going to click OK. And the first thing I want to do is I'm just going to bring this up above the terrain. And now what we can also do is create duplicates. If we go up here to duplicate or scatter replicate objects, if we go to duplicate, which is just left mouse clicking on it, you can see it made a duplicate object right next to it. I'm going to delete that and go back and show you scatter. If you right mouse click, there's a lot more options for scatter. And we can generate as many copies as we want. We can use selected objects, so you could have other objects replace it. And we have scatter objects right here, and I'm just going to leave it with these settings that we have right now and click OK. And it's going to create 19 copies all throughout, just randomly. And it's rotating them around, but as you can see, their heights are obviously different, so you'd have to go in and change a lot of those settings. But right now, all of our plum trees are selected. Well, let's say instead of doing an ecosystem, we wanted to just apply these to this terrain right here. What we can do is just select dropped object, and it's automatically going to drop all these trees down to that terrain. And it's all set up perfect, so it's directly on the terrain. And it may look a little off in our OpenGL view, but that's because it's showing a lower version of our terrain in the OpenGL. As you can see, it looks a little higher, but that's actually directly on our terrain. So that's a really neat way of creating certain trees. There's also a lot of different scattering techniques you can do with that, and just get some really neat effects. So that's a good way of adding trees directly onto a terrain if you don't want to be using ecosystems. Another thing too, if we take a look at our tree, we're just going to grab one of them. This tree has multiple surfaces on it because we have the leaf surface and we have the trunk surface. If we go up to the top right here, we can see one of two, and right now our bark is selected. If we right mouse click, then we're going to see those leaves. So we double click, and that's our leaf texture and in the material editor. So we can edit that a lot differently. And then we can go back to that first one, and this is our bark, which is set to a procedural terrain right now. But if you own the seamless bark collection that we have from asileFX, there's tons of different bark textures you could actually apply just by using a mapped picture and apply that to your tree, and that way you get a realistic bark texture. Because right now this procedural doesn't look very real. Depending on how far away you are, it won't really matter, but if you want to get nice close-ups of bark and things like that on the tree, I would definitely go with some of the texture maps that are available out there. And like I said, we have a collection for that, which is really neat, and that's just called Seamless Bark. And you could just load your bark textures onto these trees and get a nice realistic look on them. So we'll go ahead and close that out. And now we're going to start to take a look at some of the animation features in Vue.